One city I definitely want to visit one day is Rome. Eat the pasta, devour the bread, drink the wine, see the Colosseum and those other great landmarks, yeah, that too. Eat more great food, take in the culture, drink more wine, enjoy the nightlife, have a late-night snack and some more vino. And if a reincarnated Audrey Hepburn happened to be kicking around and wanted a writer to be her escort, I'm sure Bev would understand if I volunteered. But all this talk about ingesting liquids leads me to our longtime sponsor. They are Sparkplug Coffee, and they continue to offer the freshest beans in this part of the world, our home country of Canada. These bad little boys are fairly traded, premium Arabica beans. Arabica. Caffeine can be a godsend, but Sparkplug also has decaf and half-calf, and they offer a variety of roasts and blends. They even give you the option of a rotating seasonal blend. What would disappoint Gregory Peck and Audrey Hepburn during their stay in Rome is that this yummy stuff is only available to Americans and Canadians. But people in those two countries will get their package delivered within a week, so that's pretty great. Shipping in Canada? Absolutely free. Being a member of Sparkplug's Autopilot Coffee Club, which is so not a Coffee of the Month club, gets you perks and deals that non-members are excluded from. Excluded. They're out. They don't get to be part of this. And it saves you lira on every order. You can customize your membership to get your Sparkplug when it suits you. So if you're working in Europe and falling for a princess, then you can put a pause on the coffee deliveries for a little while. Sparkplug.coffee/HYES is what your finger should be typing to save 20% off your next order. HYES is Have You Ever Seen's promo code, so we get a little kickback in the process of helping to keep money safely in your pocket. Lira. That is if you're not royalty. Apparently they don't carry money around. And now that I've been fully honest about our efforts to reap some rewards from this partnership with Sparkplug Coffee, you and I, good listener, can go our separate ways and wish forever a relationship could have worked out. Meanwhile, I think it's time for the podcast proper to get going. So, Andrew Luther, strike up your one-man band and please play that theme music. And action! Have you ever seen Roman Holiday? And I ever saw it for the, I think, fourth ever time a few ever days ago. My name is Ryan Ellis, and I'm your solo host of this 494th edition of Have You Ever Seen? Have you ever seen? Normally I sit opposite my wife Bev and look into her big blue eyes as we jaw about motion picture classics, but these Every Other Friday shows are always just me on my own. A little bonus content for you regular listeners, and probably irregular ones too. Maybe someone will search for Roman Holiday, a podcast online, and find this one and say, hey, this guy talks by himself. What's going on here? I have a wife that does this with me usually. And if you happen upon this episode without having seen Roman Holiday, but don't want me to discuss every little bit of it, then you're not going to get what you want, because that's exactly what I'm about to do. You can't always get what you want. I do sing a lot by myself, don't I? This is the second last episode on this channel this month, which we have been calling the month of crazy, stupid love. Interestingly, Roman Holiday might fit the theme of iconic romance as much as anything else we did for the past 4 weeks. Or even last February when we called it the month of strangelove. Now, I'll get into Roman Holiday's bona fides in a second, but I just have to say off the top what I probably said during our previous Audrey Hepburn episodes years ago, which is that I used to go into her films expecting to not like her. I figured that prim, prissy, good little girl routine would irritate me to death. It always seems like that's what she's going to be. I think so anyway. But it never did, and she's not those things really anyway. Sometimes maybe she's been that, but not often. I read her autobiography, or maybe a biography, whatever. It really helped a lot because she seemed so normal for somebody who was such a big star and a good-looking woman and all of that. She's not an actress I've seen much in the past several years, which has been a mistake on my part, and I think Bev and I have reviewed just 2 of her pictures ever, My Fair Lady and Breakfast at Tiffany's. My Fair Lady's not her best work. We covered Tiffany's going on 7 years ago, and Lady was even longer ago than that. Although those and Roman Holiday are the most logical ones to pick if you're going to get into the Audrey of it all. And when you find out just how down-to-earth she was when she wasn't performing in movies, like I said, the autobiography and such, doing all that charity and humanitarian work, you can't help liking this woman that much more. So Paramount showed William Wyler's film at a few festivals in 1953, then released it for general audiences 70 years ago on September 2nd. It succeeded handsomely and finished in the top 10 at the box office that year. And it was well received by critics and such. I'm about to talk about how lauded this was, and it's a lot. A lot of lauding. The film is beloved on Rotten Tomatoes. 95% of critics like it, and 93% of audiences do too. Those critics have written 64 fresh reviews and only 3 rotten ones, although I was going to do this movie, or we were going to do this movie a couple years ago, and I had numbers that were different, of course. People have reviewed it since, and it was actually something like 98% and 95, I think, percent for the critics and audiences. There were maybe 52 reviews at the time, not 64, and only 1 rotten. So anyway, 64 and 3 is still pretty good. The movie's well liked. The Academy Awards gave this flick 3 Oscars. In what was her first major role, Audrey Hepburn took home the Best Actress trophy, beating out luminaries like Ava Gardner and Deborah Kerr. Dalton Trumbo won for his original story, and the legendary Edith Head added to her collection of hardware when she won for her costumes, black and white costumes. Head won 8 Oscars in total, and this was her 5th. She didn't give any kind of speech when she won, though, just thanked the presenter, Gene Tierney, for giving her the bauble, shook her hand, and that was that. Hepburn was gracious in her acceptance speech, but didn't say very much. I think she was overwhelmed and probably quite nervous. She never won again, even though she was nominated 4 more times, including the following year for Sabrina. The Heps did win the Jean Hersholt Humanitarian Award, but she died a few months before the ceremony in 1993, so her son Sean had to accept on her behalf. As for Trumbo's Oscar win for this movie, he didn't even get to go up to the podium at all. Ian McClellan Hunter was credited for writing the story because Trumbo had been blacklisted, and this is back when story and screenplay were separate categories. The Academy rectified that crapola finally, but not until, again, 1993, nearly 20 years after Trumbo had died, and 40 years after this movie came out. They aren't prompt at the Academy, are they? Dalton won a second Oscar for his story for The Brave One a few years later, but the credit on that movie was Robert Rich. At least the Academy made sure Trumbo got that Oscar not long before he died. As for Oscar night in 1954 for the 1953 films, when Hunter's name was announced as the big bad winner, there was polite applause for the guy who accepted on Hunter's behalf. Hunter refused to pick up a trophy for work he didn't even do, you see. And the applause stops before the guy even gets to the stage. It's so funny when you see that in the old shows. Maybe you sometimes see that now. Not everybody gets a standing ovation, of course, even at the modern Oscars, but it's weird when no one's applauding and you're still walking up there. So I wonder if everyone knew this old man was just a front for a front. The irony, too, is that Kirk Douglas presented this award, and he was the one given so much credit for ending the blacklist when he hired Dalton Trumbo to write Spartacus several years after this. More importantly than just hiring him, Douglas gave Trumbo on-screen credit. No more fronts. Dalton Trumbo, incidentally, was an uncredited writer on The Way We Were, which I covered 2 weeks ago as part of this month of crazy, stupid love. Roman Holiday won those 3 Oscars, but was nominated for 7 more. Best Picture, William Wyler for his direction. Those 2 went to From Here to Eternity. The director was Fred Zinnemann that won that. Eddie Albert for supporting actor, Ian McClellan Hunter and John Dighton for the screenplay, Robert Swink for his editing, and the movie was also up for its black and white cinematography and its sets. I think the city of Rome deserves most of the credit for the sets, but I guess the designers had to build the interiors at least. Okay, one more thing I'll say about the Oscars is that the winner of Best Actress and Best Actor in this particular year of 1953, Hepburn and William Holden, went on to co-star in Sabrina the very next year. And I believe I read somewhere, maybe her autobiography, that the 2 of them were an item after working on that film. They would have gotten married, but he didn't want to have kids, or couldn't have kids maybe, and she did want some. Or maybe it was the other way around. But she had kids, so it must have been that she wanted them and he didn't. Anyway, she needed somebody to pick up her Hersholt Award after she was dead, after all. She needed to have kids. Holden's Oscar that year was for Stalag 17. Bev and I might check that one out sometime this year and post some thoughts about it on this channel. So Audrey won for a movie about love, and Bill won for a movie about war. Roman Holiday was entered into the National Film Registry in 1999. We've covered 9 other pictures that joined it that year. Do the Right Thing, Laura, My Man Godfrey. Oh, by the way, Laura, another doomed romance. Well, maybe it works out in the end, but it's a weird romance anyway. Crazy, stupid romance. Strange Love. So Night of the Living Dead, Raiders of the Lost Ark, The Shop Around the Corner, which I covered last December, A Streetcar Named Desire, The 10 Commandments, and The Wild Bunch. As for American Film Institute lists, Roman Holiday was 4th in the rom-com category of the top 100 genres. City Lights was number 1, and it was also 4th again on the top 100 passions. Casablanca was number 1. It was nominated for the 2007 AFI Top 100 list, or my notes here, list, and the top 100 laughs. The humor isn't gut-busting in Roman Holiday, but Wyler is at least trying to be funny. I was amused and charmed, let's put it that way. Okay, here we go with the story. The first thing to notice is the first thing, the opening credits, which say presenting Peck and introducing Hepburn. She had been in several films before this. I counted 5, but this was her coming out party. Hollywood liked to do that, pretend that someone is brand new and the world is just meeting them in this glamorous endeavor, when that person might have been in front of a camera several other times before. And of course it was fun in Logan Lucky, where Daniel Craig is the introducing credit. We talked about that in Scoring the Movies a while ago, Chris and I did. And then Julia Roberts is introducing. We brought that up in that podcast because that was Soderbergh again. In Ocean's 11, it was introducing Julia Roberts, even though she was a star 10 years earlier, at least that long, because a Pretty Woman. So back to the story. A newsreel promotes that Princess Anne, Hepburn of course, is on a diplomatic tour of London and Paris, so we know she's not British or French. It isn't made clear where Anne is from, but she obviously can't be visiting those places if she's from one of them. Although this princess certainly sounds British, Hepburn is just talking the way she always did. Anyway, the newsreel even says Anne meets with the ambassador from her country, quote-unquote, without actually saying what that country is. And this, to me, is strange. If they were crapping on a real place in this movie, then yeah, it doesn't make sense to bruise their ego in a rom-com. Why say Poland stupid, use a fake country? But they weren't crapping, honey. I wouldn't think so anyway. Wyler and Trumbull could have just made up a place like they tend to do in terrorist movies now. Not that it matters much anyway. We just know she's a foreigner in Italy, and so is Peck's character, who we are a ways away from meeting, by the way, so stay tuned. While standing in the receiving line so dozens of people can be announced and shake her hand, the princess slips out of one of her shoes, which no one but Wyler's camera can see because her dress is so long. It's a comedy thing, but it also humanizes Anne immediately. Women must find it almost impossible to wear high heels for very long. Much like having to deal with periods and bras, I'm so glad I don't have to deal with footwear like this. But Anne can't even properly rest her feet because she has to dance with all kinds of men, seeming like she'd rather be absolutely anywhere else. When she's up in her room at the embassy, hair down, comfortable nightgown, she hears music outside the embassy down below, and you know she'd just love to go and join the party and be a regular person for a while. Her assistant reads off her packed schedule, though, which would depress anyone. I like being busy, but this was a lot of stuff she had to do. I've never respected royalty and likely never will. Not into democracy. I'm looking at you, England. But I don't doubt they must have days where it drives them insane to have so many appointments. Even though Anna said she was too tired to sleep. We were both too tired to sleep. She does pass out before the doctor can arrive to give her a shot to help her sleep. I don't sleep very well myself, but I hope to God I never have to resort to using drugs to help me drift off. And my bigger issue anyway is staying asleep for 7 or 8 hours, which is maybe more what this shot is for too. Remember that line in 61 Asterisk where Thomas Jane as Mickey Mantle complains that they wake you up to give you a shot to put you to sleep. Although maybe in that case too, it's to keep you asleep. Princess Anne, longs to escape her structured, sequestered, palace-bound life and, well, I guess she plans to fight through the effects of that shot because she gets dressed in a fairly ordinary outfit and sneaks out of her room. She slips into the back of a delivery truck when the driver isn't looking and she's free! This entire movie was shot on location in Rome, incidentally, and we start to see evidence of that now. Plenty of these shots could have been achieved in Hollywood with back projection, that kind of thing, but it's clearly Europe. And of course we'll see more examples of that in so many of the scenes she'll have with Peck when they're roaming around Rome. Now I read that Cary Grant was up for the Joe role that Greg Peck played, but Grant said he didn't want to play opposite someone as young as Hepburn. Cary was 25 years older than the odds. Of course he did work with her in a love story 10 years later when they did Charade together. I saw somewhere that the real problem might have been that Cary didn't want to play second fiddle in what was obviously going to be her film. And if that's true, it's an ego problem, an ego thing, but he's also not wrong. This movie belongs to the lady star, and they would have no matter who played Her Highness. In fact, Peck doesn't even appear until the 17-minute mark, when we get a glimpse of him gambling with 6 or 7 other guys. So Grant probably didn't like that either, that he didn't appear for many pages of the screenplay. Anne's drugs were effective because she is half asleep on a bench down on the street when Joe happens across her. He's concerned for her safety, but he doesn't recognize her. He just thinks she's drunk and needs looking after. If I saw Meghan Markle asleep on a park bench, I think I'd know her. Of course, I've seen her thousands of times probably, and this is set in 1953. Neither Joe nor a taxi driver want to take responsibility for what they think is a lush, but Joe eventually relents and takes her to his apartment. She asks that he undress her, which he doesn't want to do, but she's not used to putting on or taking off all of her clothes. Of course, she did put on this outfit, but I guess the drugged-up lady could have forgotten that in the meantime. The VIPs at the embassy who are responsible for the direct heir to the throne are going loopy about her absence. But we know, because he's Gregory Peck, that she's in the safest hands possible with Joe, who politely went out for a walk to let her settle in, only to find her dead asleep in his bed when he comes back. Joe rolls her, comically, onto the couch, which she barely notices because drugs are great. I've been told. I believe it. It's charming that William Wyler's next shot has Peck sleeping at the foot end of the bed because, even though they're not sharing the bed, she's on the couch right beside, this sleeping in opposite directions positioning is considered proper and a way to avoid groping or touching. Bev and I have been doing it for a little while now. Works out nicely. Pretty well, yeah. Joe goes to his American News Service's office and lies to his editor that he went to the press conference to hear what Princess Anne had to say. I don't think I said that before. He's a writer. Anyway, you probably got that. You've probably watched that movie. He's giving Bart Simpson-esque answers about what Anne said, but in fairness, the boilerplate answers he gives to his boss are quite likely what she would have said if she'd been there. But since Hennessy, the editor, who's played by Hartley Power, knows Anne was reported as being too ill to do that day's press conference, he's cheesed at Joe for fibbing. And this is how our hero discovers just who it is who's sleeping on his couch, because Hennessy shows him a picture of her in the paper. Joe is a nose for news and a yen for money, so he makes a deal with Hennessy to cash in huge if he can get an exclusive interview with Her Highness. He'll get $5,000, I assume American money, for the interview, but Hennessy bets him $500 he won't deliver. That was a lot of money back in 1953 for a bet. Whatever happened to a $50 bet? Of course, Joe is sure he'll make this work and he won't lose the bet since the girl in question is passed out in his bedroom and no one in the world knows that other than him. Well, maybe he told somebody in the meantime, but you get my point. Somebody he can trust. That doctor who gave her that knockout shot must have graduated at the bottom of his class at med school because Anne is still asleep when Joe gets back. It must be lunchtime by now. Even if she hadn't snuck out and ended up at Joe's place, how capable would she have been to go about her normal day in the embassy? Put her to sleep, dude. Don't half kill her. Doctors. When Anne finally snaps to, I like this, she doesn't overreact to seeing Joe standing over her. In many movies, there would be a supposedly hilarious, loud scream. Don't look at me, I'm indecent. Then she'd cover herself in 12 blankets and scramble to get out of there. Of course, Audrey did win the Oscar, so if she played this scene badly, I would have taken issue with that award. Princess Princess Anne, lies about who she is to this commoner and says her name is Anya. See if you get those Princess Jasmine references. You probably do. She doesn't know that Joe knows who she is, of course. She takes a bath while Joe calls his photographer pal Irving, who was one of the many players in that poker game the night before. Eddie Albert is Irv, the guy who was up for Best Supporting Actor in this film. I wonder if Peck was annoyed that his two co-stars went to the Oscars that year, but he didn't. Maybe he went, but he wasn't up for anything. Peck was up for Best Actor 5 times and won for To Kill a Mockingbird 9 years later, but he went 13 years between noms after 12 O'Clock High in 1949 and then Mockingbird in 1962. He had 4 nominations in the first few years of his career, so he probably assumed it would always be like that. But no, not for 13 years and then never again after To Kill a Mockingbird. So Joe lets Anne leave for a minute, but then, accidentally on purpose, cuts her off and offers to show her the city. She has no money, no lira, so he ponies up 1,000 lira, which he says is about $1.50 in American dollars. Although, now that I think about it, well, that's his reference point. I wonder if she would even get what that means exactly because she's not American. Thank God for the euro that they invented whenever it was, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, because I can never grasp foreign currency. Not that I understand the euro either. Joe lets her leave with that lira, although he is following her. But you'd think he'd follow a little closer, considering he'll owe $500 to Hennessy if she gets out of his sight. Princess Anne, walks through a marketplace, seeming delighted by the hustle and bustle and cussle and wustle and what does bustle mean? I think I spelled it right. B-U-S-T-L-E, bustle. But also how normal all this is to the plebes. Maybe to be a little less recognizable, Anne gets her beautiful long hair cut short into a bob. Of course, if you know Roman Holiday, you recognize that haircut, not the long one. I agree with the hairdresser, who's reluctant to cut so much off, but it's not like Audrey H. looks anything short of lovely no matter what she does. As young as Hepburn actually was, which was about 24, she looks even younger after that trim. Somehow Anne has enough money to pay for the haircut, then some gelato, plus she bought shoes earlier on her travels. All that with $1.50? 1953, man. When she and Joe reconnect on the famous Spanish Steps, he suggests they go see the sights together and have their Roman holiday. When Anne asks what he does for a living, it's clever that Joe tells her he sells fertilizer after he hears a horse's whinny because he does peddle a lot of BS in his job. I guess it's this scene that got Eddie Albert his Oscar nomination as much as any other because he joins them and almost reveals, comically, that he recognizes her. Joe basically abuses him, comically, to shut him up. And then he gets money from Irving, too, because he needs some help here with the old dollars and lira, cutting him in on the deal to snag this interview. And, of course, Irving will be the photographer in this situation. We'll get a lot of shots, real pictures, candid pictures, of Anne's exploits. Irv and Joe take Anne to see the Colosseum, but following that brief scene comes the poster shot and one of the most well-known parts of this movie, which is Peck and Hepburn riding through Rome on a Vespa. She ends up at the handlebars, although it's clearly not Audrey driving. A stunt double who looks nothing like her is at the controls, and that person puts people in danger with all the reckless driving. Peck's stunt person isn't exactly his spitting image either, by the way. They're arrested for this tomfoolery, although Joe and Irving get them out of it when they say they're with the press, which of course is the truth, even though they tell Anne that they're lying about their media credentials. I guess this is why filmmakers had Anne cut her hair short, too, because somebody in that police station should have recognized her otherwise. At least one person should have said, I know who that is. And speaking of truth, here's the other famous scene in this movie, the mouth of truth, where legend has it that if you put your hand in the lion's stone mouth, it'll get bitten off. Joe gives it a go and then acts like old Stoney has a teethy grip on his hand. Anne freaks out, but he only pretends his hand is gone, using an old vaudeville technique of hiding your hand in your sleeve. Peck did that without Hepburn knowing he was going to, so he had her going that he really did lose his hand. I, Ryan, have developed a reputation in recent years of being fearless, which is probably unearned, but I, Ryan, who else is talking? It's just me, will milk this as long as I can, with Chris, Bev, and so on. Would I put my hand in that lion's mouth? Maybe, but it would be my left hand. I can't take the chance old righty would get chewed to the nub. Softball season's only a few months away, and I need my pitching hand, man. Joe in so many words tells Irv to beat it, so his bearded buddy bids adieu to Smitty, as she's been calling herself, Anya Smith. I love that Anne chose Smith as a fake last name because not only is it very ordinary, but the origin of that is, of course, blacksmith, which is one of the more physical and I would think dirtier jobs out there. The princess doesn't just loaf around when she's visiting other countries, fair. We know she has a packed schedule. Plus they put her in shoes that ruin her feet. But she's not exactly working as hard as a blacksmith either, so anyway, I thought that was fun. She went with Smith. If Joanne, the benefit of this movie, Joanne, weren't already falling for each other before, they appear to be while dancing that night, sometimes looking at somebody and saying, hello, in a non-sexual but nonetheless intimate moment can be as erotic as a boobs-out sex scene. And oh, how I have fallen for you, do-do-do-do, a song from Pretty Woman. Somehow government agents hired by the princess's embassy track her down at this soiree, interrupting her dance with her hairdresser, who had told her about this party in the first place. If Joe and Irv hadn't stopped these guys from dragging her off at this point, I wonder what Anne's plan was. Unless she intended to completely ditch her family and defect to Italy, she had to report back to the embassy at some point. I know we talk about women's agency all the time these days, but someone in a royal family has different obligations than the average woman. She doesn't have agency. If she was planning to renounce her claim to the throne and throw her whole family and whole country into upheaval, well, fine, but that's also pretty selfish of her. As much as I don't respect royalty, unless we're going to abolish it altogether, obviously we're not going to, then there are duties to be performed. You're supposed to be professional! Doing Steve Buscemi made me thirsty. Yawn. I got those sleeping pills in me now, I guess, too. The sleeping drugs. A fight breaks out with the agents, during which Irving snaps some great action photographs when Anne fights back. Maybe Joe figured out what these guys are there to do, but maybe he doesn't know? Either way, she should be asking him why he isn't curious about why strange men were trying to abduct this ordinary person, Anya Smith. She had told Joe she's just a student after all. Once they fished themselves out of a river after Joe got punched into it by one of the agents, Joe kisses her. At last. I guess they didn't do anything untoward when they went back to his place to change into dry clothes. Although what I was really wondering at this point was how did they ditch those agents? I don't think those hired goons are going to get paid for this massive, massive failure. Love is clearly on the menu, but what Anne wants on the menu is dinner, and she wants to make some for Joe. She says she knows how to do all the domestic type things, which I think might be true of Audrey too, that she wasn't a person that didn't ever do things for herself, even when she got famous and rich. And this character knows how to do these things, but she's never actually had to. Well, none of that matters because Joe doesn't even have a kitchen anyway. He always eats out, he says. No wonder he's so broke. When Anne says she's got to bail, of course not explaining why, the hug they share almost made me gasp, gotta be honest. Peck and Hepburn really go for it, and it's one of those enveloping, I can't imagine living without you kind of hugs. They do a little more kissing, then Joe drops her off near the embassy. Near, because Anne still isn't owning up to who she really is. But my mind went to, aren't they sitting on soaking wet seats in that car? They drove to his apartment in Irving's car after getting out of the water, didn't they? So the front seat should be a mite damp. If not, sopping. They hug hard again and then kiss oh so hard. I don't know if these two actors were getting to know each other's naughty bits off camera, but they sure do sell how in love they are in these past few scenes. I don't remember all of Audrey's romantic movies by heart, but old Greg has got to be one of her best ever on-screen lovers, even if on-screen lovin' is as far as it went. And Anne is back on the job after 24 hours away, even though she tells her handlers that she wouldn't be back at all if she didn't accept that she has boring and exhausting duties to perform as a member of the royal family. I didn't do the nutshell, and I didn't fix this earlier. Man, as you can tell, I'm reading most of this. Some of it's offhand, like right now. I guess I'll do the nutshell right now. This isn't entirely what I want to even go with, but anyway, Roman holiday in a nutshell. Boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy also loses $500 bet. Because Hennessy shows up at Joe's apartment to hear the story, but Joe denies that he was with Her Highness all day. Irv shows up with all the pictures he took of the princess being a normal person, but Joe, comically, keeps him from telling Hennessy anything. So Joe loses his bet, which means his salary is going to be seriously garnished for a while to pay off that $500. But at least he doesn't try to prevent Irv from selling the photos, which would help Irv's bottom line. But if Joe is hoping to protect Anne from embarrassment or minor scandal, the pictures will do that even more effectively than any story he could have written would. The shot of Anne smashing a guitar over the head of one of these agents would be a big deal to her snooty parents, having their daughter look to the world like a ruffian who resorts to musical violence. Worst kind of violence, musical violence. Although if Anne wants her life to change and she doesn't want to be stuffy all the time, pictures of things like that and a story that describes her Roman holiday in detail would do nothing but humanize her. Anyway, the jig is up when Anne sees Joe standing with Irv amongst the ladies and gentlemen of the press. One of the reporters asking if a federation in Europe would improve things certainly does remind us that the continent eventually did become the European Union. Joe coyly reveals to her that he isn't going to talk about what she did all day yesterday, which gets an appreciative and wry little smile out of her. Anne crosses up the embassy muckety-mucks yet again, though, and decides to talk to some of the press people individually. When she gets to Irv, he proves to have a heart, and apparently not a big yen for lira, because he gives her the folder full of incriminating pictures. Of course, Anne's real reason for meeting all these press guys one by one is to touch Joe, his hand anyway, one last time. No more hugs, no more kisses. She leaves with her entourage, and a glassy-eyed Joe sadly walks away. And thus, here's another movie on the AFI's Top 100 Passions list that doesn't end up with the lovers actually being together happily ever after. So the cast, although I'll only highlight the three leads here. Gregory Peck, who was 13 years older than Audrey, not the quarter century that Cary Grant was in many good or even great movies, but the only podcasts on this channel that have ever covered him before were To Kill a Mockingbird and The Omen. It's possible we'll eventually review Cape Fear, either version because he's in both, got a small role in the Scorsese one, Spellbound, pretty good one for Hitchcock, or one of those classic westerns he was in. I've always found Greg to be a bit stiff, although his performance as Atticus in To Kill a Mockingbird has really stuck with me since we covered it for the podcast about 8 years ago. That was great work, worthy of the Oscar, I think. Although it probably should have gone to O'Toole in Lawrence of Arabia, in his, I think, first movie. But Peck was due, and Peck was great. And by his standards, he's fun and pretty loose in this movie. As for Audrey, we've only seen her before today in the two pictures I've already mentioned, Breakfast at Tiffany's and My Fair Lady. Where the devil are my slippers? Her four known-for films on the IMDb are those two, Roman Holiday and Charade. I thought about covering Charade in this slot instead, but Cary Grant has come up a lot on Have You Ever Seen lately, plus Roman Holiday is just a better and more famous film. To say that Eddie Albert worked on the small screen a lot would be a big understatement. You scroll through his stuff on the IMDb and it's TV, TV, TV. He did his share of films, though, too. For instance, he was the warden in the original version of The Longest Yard, which Chris and I covered on Scoring the Movies many years ago. We recently covered the remake. Very recently, but a long time ago we covered the original film. The director, and for that matter the producer, so he was up for both of those Oscars that night but didn't win either of them, was of course William Wyler. We discussed Wuthering Heights, The Best Years of Our Lives, and Ben-Hur well over 8 years ago, back when we were still looking at the AFI's Top 100. I don't think we've talked about him since Ben-Hur, which was probably the spring or the late winter of 2015. Man. Wyler's the man who was nominated for the most directing Oscars of all time, although Stephen and Marty are catching up, but they've got a little ways to go still. I think they both have 9, and I think he had 12. And he won 3 times, for Ben-Hur, for Best Years of Our Lives, and also for Mrs. Miniver. Frank Capra was originally going to do this, but he passed, as did George Stevens. Capra made perfect sense, since he was known for having a comic flair, plus he's Italian. He and Stevens also had a better track record with romantic comedy than Wyler did, but it's not like Willie was way out of his element doing this movie. It's at least amusing on a regular basis, and likable, and pretty much in line with films those other guys made. They might have made it better, but it wouldn't have been much better. So yeah, I like Roman Holiday. I like the 2 stars in this more than I did in almost anything else they ever did, in fact. Although I'll repeat that Audrey Hepburn never fails to charm me, even when I think she won't this time. You would go broke fast if you underestimated this woman the way I once did. You'd lose that $500 bet. And that was Roman Holiday. Delightful rom-com with a bittersweet, almost tear-inducing ending. Thumbs, they're up. If all goes to plan, this episode will be available on YouTube around the time the podcast goes up. Usually that's the case, within a few hours anyway. We've been posting all of our 2023 episodes on the tube. The shows that Bev and I do together have had about 10 minutes, or sometimes more, of bonus footage with us on camera, talking about corrections to the episode in question, then highlighting new movies we've seen, a lot of Oscar nominees lately. We even discuss listener feedback. These solo episodes I do go on YouTube too, but those are accompanied by just our graphic. Maybe one day I'll sit and do a video of just me, but I haven't yet. So if you just spent all this time listening to this, you get the exact same thing there. But hey, go check it out anyway. At least subscribe. Help us grow the channel. At HYES Ellis, so ELLIS, is how to find our main page. Just put that in your browser, and you'll see our YouTube videos. If you haven't left Twitter in an Elon-induced snit, you can find us there. I am at MovieFiend51, and you can tweet Bev too. She's at Bev Ellis Ellis. I get it, he's terrible, but ignore him best you can. Our email address, he being Elon, our email address is haveyoueverseenpodcast@gmail.com. Please like, subscribe, favorite, share, tell your movie-loving friends about us, do all the things you're supposed to do to help a podcast or a YouTube channel grow. And if you drink coffee, I'm telling you, Sparkplug Coffee has the goods. Go to sparkplug.coffee/HYES to get 20% off some great beans. On Monday, February 27th, Bev and I will be putting the finishing touches on this month of crazy, stupid love as we chew the fat about Terrence Malick's Badlands. We've never covered a Terry project before, and Sissy Spacek has rarely come up either. This one is about the Sis and Marty Sheen driving around the western United States and doing stuff. Some of that stuff is pretty bad. So that's it. Thanks so much for lending me your time. I'm going to go make a pasta dinner now. In my kitchen. Pretty big kitchen. We like it. We don't go out to eat all the time. Almost ever, really. I'll also sip some wine and then see the sights with an older gentleman. I just hope he kisses me as passionately as Greg Peck kisses Audrey H. and Roman Holiday. I would consider giving up my royal gig and chucking it all to be with him if he did. I'm only partly kidding. End cut.